Thank you very much for taking this additional time at the end of what has, I'm sure, been a hectic visit to talk to us a little bit about your writing. We really appreciate that.
It's my pleasure. It's really the oxygen. If you could just provide more oxygen.
You're starting to feel
I really am.
and drowsy.
So.
The turkey luncheon probably didn't help with that. Well, obviously, throughout your visit, we've been talking about the role of multiple media and composing in different modes as a way to reinvigorate the humanities, as a way to challenge our ways of thinking about things. I was wondering if you could start by characterizing the balance for you right now as a composer, as a writer, between the work that you do in multimedia, like your presentations for YouTube, and then the more traditional print-based scholarship. How do you balance that right now, or where are you leaning?
Well, the real answer to that question has more to do with what I've been doing for the past 6 years, which is I just finished 2 terms as chair of the department. And so writing and publishing in traditional venues just hasn't been part of my life for the past 6 years. And so where I am right now is really trying to decide what my next major writing project is going to be. And for a time when I was traveling, I mean, I've been traveling a great deal over the past 18 months making presentations. And there have been times when I said I can't imagine writing a book ever again. You know, one of the things I've learned over the past 18 months, and again, this is more about the context than it is actually about the composing, is that there's still significant work that can only be realized in writing. So the YouTube publications that Paul Hammond and I have put together, I do consider my most significant and influential intellectual work. But I also know none of it would have been possible had I not produced these other 2 books. So where I am is my multimedia stuff is all produced collaboratively. So what Paul and I do is we blocked out the Center Cannot Hold, and now that we've completed this course and doing this other work, we're moving towards 2. We've already got 2 of our next productions mapped out. But in terms of writing, I think I've finally settled on a project that I want to work on that would be individually authored. And then I've talked, I'll be revising the New Humanities Reader for 4th edition, so that's a collaborative writing project. And then Paul and I have actually talked about a collaborative writing project as well. So the past 6 years have really moved me into collaborative composing in both areas. And then the writing as such is waiting for a moment where I can begin to focus on it.
See, it's interesting you mentioned the writing. The writing that waits was actually the title of one of your blog posts pretty recently, where you were talking about the things that sort of get set aside, that are things that you can't get back to. And one of the things that you've been discussing throughout your time here is that need to wrestle with ambiguity, the need to think things through and to not rush to argument or advocacy, and trying to get our students to do that. When you have a very busy schedule, whenever you're traveling a lot and have deadlines for other people working in media that are so immediate, how do you as a writer make that time or space to really work through these issues and think about them before tackling them? Sure.
Well, that's another big thing that's changed. I mean, I used to be a very deadline conscious, deadline respectful writer, and I've overcommitted a lot, and it's just routine for me now to say either I can't do the thing I promised to do, or I can only do it in 6 months from now. So the 2 most recent writing tasks I completed were both essentially a year late. And each one of them sort of percolates in the back of my mind. And then the way my composing process works is I don't want to rush it. You know, I want to wait for the startling connection to surface. So when Doug introduced me yesterday, he's not aware of this, but when he read the opening to the nervous system, that actually is the moment that my writing process changed with that sentence, actually. I had been a traditional scholar up till that point, doing research in the archives on the history of educational reform, and producing chapters and building a book. And then I was in this situation after a family crisis, and I felt that I needed writing to do something very different for me. And I was riding a train up to Boston to give a talk, and when I had the sentence for his second attempt, actually when I just had that set of words, I just had the whole thing, right? That you just need to hear that much, and you know you're in the midst of a family crisis, and that you've transgressed, for some people, academic boundaries of appropriate commentary. And so the piece began with that sentence, and then because I was working between dealing with all the medical professionals and teaching and dealing with kids and everything, the piece emerged as a mosaic. The piece comes in chunks separated by asterisks. And the book itself then emerged out of this sense that we can use writing as a way to make unfolding sense of unfolding events. So it then, the book emerged around the issues of education and violence, and some of them, the 9/11 chapter is actually the last chapter I wrote in the book. It's dead center. But also I just needed to wait for the connection to show up. I did a lot of reading before I did any writing at all. A lot of research, much like I talked about this morning. I wanted to do research that pushed me off all the commonplaces about 9/11. And DeLillo reframed it for me and allowed me, reading DeLillo allowed me to say, well, there's this line in there about, retelling the 20th century as the story of recycling. And I thought, well, man, this is amazing. What if because if you lived in the apron of New York, as I do, 9/11 became just an endless series of articles about the Fresh Kills dump and the site and cleaning it up. And so I had that, but I just had to wait for that sentence, and that one begins. Something about having time stop. I can't remember it in particular, but I needed a jarring beginning for something that was going to be jarring. So my two most recent things that I've written, one, I was asked to do a chapter in a book on the use of the personal in the classroom, which, as a rule, I don't favor. It's very different when I, as an experienced writer and as a professional, elect to divulge material for pedagogical and intellectual reasons than it is to go into your classroom and ask your students to tell me about your dad's suicide attempt. I never do that, and never would. So I agreed very reluctantly to be in this book, and I said, I'm only going to be in it because I don't agree with this central tenet. And if you understand that, then I'm on board. And for this book, for this thing, I really, I was not remotely interested in revealing anything personal about myself. And instead, as I mentioned before, I'm interested in how the very notion of privacy is being erased. And so I used the piece to move through the series of increasingly remarkable revelations about politicians' sexual exploits. To say that there's actually an utter banality to these revelations. You know, Elliot Spitzer sees a high-end hooker. Really? You know, part of me wants the elimination of privacy to result in an understanding of human frailty. But that's a kind of naive hope, I would say. So I worked on that piece, and I organized my argument then in the cracks and crevices around these spectacular revelations that then end up, as they accrete, in banality. And then the next most recent project I did was I was asked to do a multiple book review for Literature and Medicine with memoirs of people reflecting, doctors and others reflecting on mortality. I really felt, you know, there's a difference between writing a book and being a writer. And two of the books I was reviewing were books that people had written. And then the third book by Julian Barnes, which is really remarkable, is called Nothing to be Frightened of. And it's his memoir of his movement from being an atheist to an agnostic, very grudgingly. And he keeps turning all these arguments over in his head for the whole book, and he keeps saying, well, it's ridiculous to believe that there would ever be this kind of supreme being or that kind of supreme being. And what he does, and why I would call it writing or literary, is that he introduces into this entire conversation great joy and laughter amidst these very dark and troubling ruminations. So I'm much more interested in literary, reflective, meditative writing than I am in producing scholarship at this point. I think my own sense of what the function of the humanities is not as a producer of knowledge, because I don't think we produce knowledge. I think we provide occasions for enriching the human experience, and that has a very short expiration date on it. It's context bound, and it's invaluable. Everybody needs and benefits from instruction about how to live a fuller, richer life. And the work that I use writing for at this point is for cultivating habits of deliberation and meditation.
And so in terms of your process, which you've mentioned before, that in some ways the personal started coming to you, in some ways it had to grow out of the rumination, the thing that hit you on the train. It seems from what I've read of your material that you have a couple of very different ways of writing for different purposes. You know, so for example, the difference between the older scholarship, the literary reflection, the formal presentations as opposed to, like, say, your blog, right? And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how your process differs, you know, in terms of getting there. You know, you already mentioned the difference between collaboration as opposed to your solo work. You talked a bit about your process for This Is How We Dream in the blog and sort of those constraints. But, you know, is it a completely different experience for you as a writer when you're approaching the reflective as opposed to, say, I'm going to comment on the new stadium, or
right.
I'm going to create a YouTube video that I hope will make people think, if it's the idea driven as opposed to the event driven, as opposed to the necessity for career driven.
Right.
How do those exigencies shape the way you approach a project?
I would say most immediately and surprisingly for me, the greatest influence on my writing right now is Facebook. And I never expected that to be the case, right? I opened a Facebook page with great reluctance, and I tried to use it for pedagogical purposes at one point, since students don't answer email anymore or look at email anymore. And I asked them, well, what can I do in order to communicate with you? And they said, well, form a group on Facebook. And I did that, and then I was like, oh my God, that's ghastly. There's a reason why the other one's called MySpace, right? It was like, yeah, that is your space. It's not my space. So those initial experiences really pushed me off dealing with it. And then once I went on research leave after I stepped down as chair, I tried to start a blog about a year ago, but I haven't found myself to be a blogger. I'm not somebody who's sitting around with a lot of opinions that I feel ready to share or that I want people to attend to. I just don't think it's worth anybody's time. And I didn't want to go there, right? We were talking about social networking. It's like, I don't even want to read my blog. Why would anybody else, right? So, but in Facebook, what I discovered is this. My area is a very peculiar, heterogeneous group of folks I went to college with, folks I went to graduate school with, and then some people I met professionally. Nobody in my family, okay, because I know people who talk about what happens when your kids are a friend to you or vice versa, right? So it's a certain kind of community. And then what I started doing is saying, there's a set of issues that concern me and that I'm thinking about, and that has to do with the future of public education, ways in which the teaching of writing is represented in national discussions, and then all issues about plagiarism and cheating. And I just started posting links to those on Facebook as a version of social bookmarking. But then I discovered it suddenly opened up a space for me to actually be in dialogue with the stuff that I was posting. And then other people would jump in and respond. And it's a community that's driven by a competition to see who can say the funniest thing, right? It's a source of real joy for me to have something that I can read on a daily basis that's going to indicate to me that no matter what, it is still possible to take joy in the daily experience of being alive. And for me, humor, the value of humor for social change has been grossly underestimated, because laughter makes possible is an alternate reading reality. And parody means you settle just on making fun of things and you're done. But the nature of work for educators is the news can be so relentlessly and overwhelmingly depressing that it just does seem like there's nothing that can be done. You try and do something in your job, you try and change how teaching goes forward, and it all fails, and you can be pushed off a cliff. And so for me, it's been really interesting to suddenly find an intellectual community that is interested in ideas, but that is also interested in communicating about them through a love of language. It's just a straight up love of language. The folks who do comment on my page are just really clever with language. And so that then in turn has invited me to produce these extended notes that I produce on Facebook. And then a couple of them I've said, this is a blog, right? Balloon Boy and the Rutgers Stadium. I just thought that's something I do want out in public. So that's really an unexpected vehicle. But as I've been talking about in my visit here, the power of the internet is that it makes the fiction of the audience real. And so to be writing on a daily basis about intellectual issues and news events that concern me, and then being in dialogue with people about them from a wide range. So it's not, friends from college, they take very different paths, right? I have a bunch of friends who served in the military, I have friends who are lawyers, friends who are business people. They don't automatically read these events the way I do or the way folks in comp would, right? So that ends up just being a very useful encounter with a potential audience.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that, as far as, because a lot of people tend to think of the social networking as being more shallow and is not a place for forwarding real ideas or grappling with issues or having any kind of a dialogue that moves beyond flame wars or whatever.
Right.
But it seems that we have been opening spaces to bring in the personal, to bring in different media, to think in different ways outside of the university. But that brings me to a question that I was wondering, and you mentioned earlier in terms of what you publish to YouTube, and then do we just link to that in academe, or if we were going to read that in a blog instead of in print. What has been the reaction of some of your colleagues in the university, administrators, to your tendency to shift into promoting that kind of approach as opposed to traditional scholarship that has generally been valued in the university?
I wouldn't say there's been a joyous embrace of this position. But I do feel very strongly that the humanities has misplayed its hand, and that the model that we have for tenure and for professional success, if it was ever appropriate, and I'm not going to weigh in on that, it's no longer appropriate. And we should actually be at the forefront of reimagining what it means to participate in the intellectual life of the moment productively. But we're not. We persist in arguments about quantity. Have you produced X number of articles? Mm-hmm. Have you produced X number of books? And then we have, I've been inside the sausage factory for 6 years. I ran tenure cases. I've seen all the letters that come in and the machinery of the whole thing. And I just don't believe in it. I don't think that there's actually an assessment of quality that ever takes place in the process. Not a fair and faithful articulation of a discussion of quality. And in fact, I think that's what the humanities is all about. How do you assess the quality of something or another? And then, as teachers, how do we improve the quality that we generated through our courses? So, I became deeply disenchanted with the profession of comm when I felt that when I joined, it was so many years ago. I was really drawn to it because it was sort of an enclave of anti-professionalism and a community of enthusiasts from disparate backgrounds. And as comp has professionalized, it's become remarkably homogenous. And I just simply didn't find the conversations or the arguments remotely interesting. I felt like people were arguing about nothing in order to argue. So I just didn't want to do that anymore with my life. I feel like the problems that we all see with our first year students are genuinely urgent. And Toulmin's taxonomy and Kenneth Burke's rhetoric and all of these things are, they seem to me to be beside the point. And so my own interest is not to manifest as being anti-intellectual or anti-scholarship, but in fact pro-intellectual work that makes a difference in the world. So, like, obviously I have the great privilege of being able to pursue this work with the protection of tenure. But I would say that my commitment to using the position of being an academic to write about the things that have been most important has been consistent. I think that's really the privilege that is actually not indulged in enough by many enough people in the profession. So you're never going to argue people out of their commitment to books. The economy is going to do that, right? And so I'm just trying to make sure that we have something in place to communicate why what we do is still important and should still be part of the university. Because the real fear at public institutions is that the future of the humanities is truly in doubt because we don't generate revenue. As you were saying, wherever you teach, when you teach in humanities, you teach in the ugliest building on campus, the most underfunded, and that's a physical manifestation of a national failure to establish the importance of what we do. If you could argue that that's because we're in an anti-intellectual nation, and I think that's a very convenient argument for academics to make. You could also say it's the result of our collective failure to establish that this kind of work is truly lastingly significant. And for me, I feel like our job is to prepare people to live the life of the mind. And that's a lifelong process. The guy who gave us $500,000 for Writers House, not an artist, not from the humanities. He was a PhD in the hard sciences. And he had been identified by the foundation as he's as highly rated a donor as you're ever going to get. And so they were thinking gigantic science building, a truly major gift. And he ends up giving to establish a learning community for undergraduates to participate in the act of creativity. Why did he do that? Well, two reasons. One, when he was solving math problems over on the science campus, his professor took the guys who were solving these problems over to his house, and they would solve the problems around the table while he played classical music and introduced them to high culture. That these weren't antithetical, they were complementary. And so he, a working class kid, ends up developing a lifelong love of opera, of all things, and then high culture, and he is particularly interested in this early Renaissance model of public performance, where there's music and singing and plays, and that's what he wanted to establish. And the other reason he gave is because he has a daughter who is interested in being a creative writer. So, so the sheer exceptionalism of that case, to me, underscores the collective failure of people in the humanities to understand that we have not done a good job of building people committed to the lifelong endurance and success of this enterprise. We haven't cultivated those people. We haven't shown them productive ways to participate. And we haven't done a good job of convincing them that there is a reason to preserve this. Beyond getting people to write. I mean, if you're in the writing business, you're going to be fine. Because everybody's going to be outraged by how terribly everybody else writes. Right? So that's a given. But the whole rest of the thing could really, disappear into the shadows at public institutions that are trying to figure out how on earth they're going to run now that they don't have any state support.
Okay, one more question, then we're going to wrap up. I know we're sort of getting out of time, but taking this forward and that idea that as a profession we need to make that life of the mind visible, that we can actually bring in different media, different ways of thinking, and also doing that in ways that will show people beyond the university what's valuable and what's exciting or what's interesting about the kind of work you're doing. What advice, because like you said, you have the production of tenure and some support there, but what advice do you give to other scholars who, are feeling that need to try to express their research, to put ideas together differently, to move into that area, to find support and feedback for that kind of creativity, to get it valued? So especially for younger scholars like ourselves who are interested in exploring that area, what advice do you give?
As I've said in other venues, there's a reason why cliches are cliches. They capture a fundamental truth. And the advice for professional success, that you follow your passion, is truly the most important impetus to act, I would say. And if while I was chair and even now I'm working with junior faculty, I say, the problem with tenure is that it becomes an end in itself. And you commit to a struggle to have a job for life and lose sight of whether you would ever want that job. And I say that even now. As things get difficult, I say, I can leave. It's not a prison sentence. For me, the real issue has always been, how do you make a job that you want to have? And for me, that's done by taking full advantage of the invitation to use your mind to think about the most serious problems of our time. And if that's what's driving you, then you'll produce in multiple ways. Some of the stuff will come out as articles. It will, because that you want to think through the problem in that way. But that won't be the only way. And the beauty of the publishing power of the internet right now is that it really becomes possible to imagine other ways of being a very effective player in a national discussion about education. But it does mean you have to learn in public, right? And that's what we're oddly just really unprepared to do, to put ideas out there and then have people say, well, that doesn't work, and I think you missed this point, or maybe I want to work with you and I'm going to take this idea and run further. But for me, I think it's vital not to step away from writing. That's essential. The traditional publishing path is going to be around for a while. I don't know how much longer, but for a while. But the example I started with before the tape was rolling about my talk last year at the MLA and publishing it up to YouTube, that talk's been available for people who want to know the ideas as I said them for a year. It's been seen 6,600 times. And the print version, which is a record turnaround at MLA, right? They get the magazine put together and it comes out in under a year. That's record time. It still isn't out, right? So this is to say, what the most merciless thing about tenure is the ticking of the clock. And you say, well, but what if young people were to do stuff like this, not the droning reading of a paper, but to articulate an idea visually and make it available, and it finds an audience, then you're moving quickly in a time when it's very difficult to. Many junior people come up for tenure having made no name for themselves, no contacts, and so you send their work out to be reviewed, and people have never heard of them. Now, this technology makes it possible for individuals to improve their odds. And I think it's essential to become literate in that environment.
Well, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I think we should